we will say that he was a success story from our healing service next Sunday. And so people are funny. I'm sure you figured that out. Sometimes it is intentional. Sometimes it is unintentional. But we're always doing crazy things or kind of foolish things or laughable things. But one of the things that's interesting to me is how it is, and certainly I have been someone who has done this repeatedly as well, but you'll communicate in some foolish ways. Does that ever happen to you? If it doesn't happen to you, I'm certain that you have watched others engage in conversation or engage people in ways that you're like, well, that's crazy to do that. Let me give you an example. Recently, I had talked to you about having to make repeated trips to the DMV. And none of us likes going to the DMV. I get that. It's unpleasant. It's time-consuming. It's all of that. And I have witnessed repeatedly people getting nasty with DMV employees. Why would you do that? I mean, just smarting off and griping and complaining. I'm telling you, if you want to see somebody that is nice, that is me talking to a DMV employee, because I'm sitting there thinking, like, this person they've got almost the power of life and death over you is what it feels like. And like all they have to say is, you need one more piece of paper or a DNA test or come up with something. There's always some letter of the law that they could work within and demand this of you. And I'm going to be super nice to these people. And they don't like being there any more than you do. And so, I'm puzzled. I'm thinking to these people as they're smarting off to a DMV employee, do you not know who it is that you're talking to? It's also interesting as I observe this, when you have people that are, and I guess other cultures do this, but certainly I think about it with respect to us here in the United States, but when if you are a native-born American and you are talking to someone with whom or for whom English is not their native language, that's always fun to watch. Because they're talking to someone and they can tell, well, all right, wait a minute, by virtue of their accent or it seems that there's some communication problem a little bit. Their English is a little slower. Maybe they might not understand it as well. So what we will do then is operate as though, first of all, this person is deaf, right? So then we raise the volume and it's like, what? And then we get really slow. I am saying, do you have, like, well, what's the matter? I'm like, this person is not deaf. They are not mentally deficient. They just have some sort of, they're not as far along in English as you or I may be. And so it is important and it's helpful that we remember the rules of engagement, how it is that we should engage people, whether it's the DMV employee, whether it is somebody that is having trouble with the language, whatever it is. We need to be mindful of those that we are dealing with, and that should have an impact on how it is that we communicate with them. Now, that's true when you understand that with people. You understand that there are ways that you will talk to your spouse that you may not speak to someone else. There are ways that you would speak to your supervisor that you may not speak to coworkers. We understand that with respect to other people, but so many times it seems as though we forget that when it comes to our relationship with God. We're thinking about that today as we continue our walk through the life of Abraham, and we're looking at some instances where Abraham seems to he stumbles. He experiences in one form or another a fall, and we're seeking to learn from those instances so that those won't be fall hazards that ensnare us. And one of the things that we're going to see him do today is that he's going to engage God in conversation. And the manner in which he does so becomes instructive for us today. And I think it should have an impact and lead us to more properly, more effectively have the communication with God that he wants us to have. So that's the thing that we want to think about today. The question is, what is it that I want to make sure that I remember when I am or when you are talking to God? Look with me as we continue the story in Genesis chapter 18. Genesis 18, we're going to pick up in the middle of a story in verse 20. So Genesis 18, verse 20, we're told that the Lord said to Abraham, that's what he's talking here, and he says, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is immense. and their sin is extremely serious. I will go down to see if what they have done justifies the cry that has come up to me. If not, I will find out." The men turned from there and went towards Sodom, and while Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Abraham stepped forward and said, "Will you really sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away instead of sparing the place for the sake of 50 righteous people who are in it? You could not possibly do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. You could not possibly do that. Won't the judge of the whole earth do what is just?" And the Lord said, "If I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake." Then Abraham answered, "Since I have ventured to speak to my Lord, even though I am dust and ashes, suppose the 50 righteous lack 5. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? Which means we start at 50, subtract 5. And so the Lord says, "I will not destroy it if I find 45 there." Then he spoke to him again, "Suppose 40 are found there." And he answered, "I will not do it on the count of 40. Then he said, "Let my Lord not be angry, and I will speak further. Suppose 30 are found there." He answered, "I will not do it if I find 30 there." Then he said, "Since I have ventured to speak to my Lord, suppose 20 are found there." He replied, "I will not destroy it on account of 20. Then he said, "Let my Lord not be angry, and I will speak one more time. Suppose 10 are found there." And the Lord answered, "I will not destroy it on account of 10. When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he departed, and Abraham returned to his place. All right, so this gives us an interesting encounter where you have this conversation that takes place between Abraham and the Lord. Now, this happened a long time ago, so you say, well, what does this have to do with me? Well, if you have a relationship with the Lord, one of the things that you hopefully realize is that he wants to have a relationship with you that's based, among other things, on regular communication. We call that prayer, but it's just talking to God. And as I do that, as you do that, what's some stuff that I need to remember so that I do so in appropriate ways? I think based on what we see here, the first thing that we need to do is this. Remember the rank of the participants. Remember the rank of the participants. All right, I said at the outset that we are picking up this story midstream, so let's establish a little bit of context. You remember that Abraham has his nephew Lot, and each of them, they have families, they have servants, they have animals. Many of these are animals and servants that came from Egypt, and so they're in an area that simply cannot sustain so many people. And because of that, they wind up separating. Long story short, Lot goes towards the city of Sodom and winds up living, becoming enmeshed in that city and in its culture. And how long exactly he is there, we're not certain, but it seems to be it's more than a few days, more than a few weeks. Maybe this has extended into years. We don't know. However, what is clear is that God is aware of what is going on in this city and its sister city, Gomorrah. And God, we're told as this chapter begins, in fact, the subject heading in my Bible says Abraham's 3 visitors. And so what appears to be 3 men, and we come to discover that it seems that 2 of these are angels and one is the Lord, and he's manifested himself in what appears to be male human form, and that's who's having this conversation. And so as Abraham is having this conversation with God about Sodom, it's because God has somehow, and we don't know the details apart from what's given here, has manifested himself so that this conversation is able to take place. And we're told that the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is immense. We come to discover later a little more fully about what's going on in these cities. And very clearly and simply stated, these are grotesquely immoral, particularly grotesquely sexually immoral cities. In short, these are cities that specifically are overrun and just simply rampant with the sin of homosexuality. So much so that we're going to see later in the book of Genesis that the men of that city are so reprobate and so deviant in their hearts, they seek to rape these individuals that appear as men, that are actually angels. That's how bad it is. And so God announces in advance of doing this what he is going to do, that he's going to bring judgment on these cities, and lets Abraham know about this. And Abraham knows, as the Lord knows also, that Abraham's nephew Lot is in that city. And maybe that's just the reason, but it seems like there's more than that. But Abraham begins to have this conversation with the Lord, and he asks a series of questions. You see them starting in verse 23. And he says, will you really sweep away the righteous with the wicked? This is an interesting, in fact, this is the first time you really have someone proactively engaging God and specifically calling God to task or to question. And so he's saying, are you really going to do this? I mean, really, so just wipe them off the map. There's righteous people, there's some bad stuff going on to be sure, but are you really going to do that? Then he says, and he starts off, and as Abraham does this, it sounds like a negotiation almost, like they're haggling back and forth, but that's not actually the case. But he begins with this question. He says, will you really sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? So he starts with a supposition, with a thought, well, of course there's 50. Of course there's 50. And then God says, yeah, for 50 I would not do it. Well, how about 45? Oh, not for 45 I will not. And he continues to digress all the way down to the number 10. But before we get to that, notice what's going on first in verse 22. It says that these men, those are the angels, they went towards Sodom while Abraham remained standing before the Lord. The word that is used there that's described as standing, that's translated as standing, is a term that was used in a judicial sense to describe an individual standing before a judge. And so Abraham is standing before the judge, and instead of being asked questions, it seems as though he starts to interrogate. But notice how he does so, starting in verse 27. He says in verse 27, since I have ventured to speak, since I've already opened my mouth, and even though I'm just dust and ashes, how about this? And then in verse 30, he says, Lord, please don't be angry with me, and I'm going to speak further. And then he says in verse 32, Lord, don't be angry with me. And I'm going to speak one more time. And so it seems as though he is operating with this sense of deep-seated respect, with this sense of deep-seated honor towards God. But notice exactly what he says. And what he says is in verse 25. You could not possibly do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. You couldn't possibly do that. Won't the judge of the earth do what is just? Do you see what he is doing? He is effectively, and he's couched it in what seems to be respectful terms. Well, I'm just dust and ashes. Well, just little old me here. But then he says, at the same time, are you even just? How in the world could you do something like this where you've got innocent people and you've got wicked people? He's calling into question, and he is challenging the very character and the integrity of God. Now again, he's so bold. Now maybe he doesn't completely, utterly cross the line because he couches it in some measure of respect. But the reality is, though he couches his language respectfully, I'm just dust and ashes, please don't be angry with me, but your character might stink. Your moral standards may be out of bounds. And to whom is he speaking? He's talking to God. And it's like he is wagging his finger at God and saying, I can't believe that you're going to do something like this. In effect saying, who do you think that you are to do something of this sort? What does this say to me? What does this say to you? You and I, as we engage God, as we talk to him, and listen, he has invited that type of relationship with us. And let me further say this. God is bigger than your questions. God is bigger than your out-of-bounds comments. God is bigger than my and your foolishness and our stupidity. And even when we act out of bounds, he is not going to crumble and wither like a dainty petal. He doesn't do so with Abraham, but it still leads us to realize we need to keep in mind the rank of the participants. That as I engage the Lord, I am not talking to my peer. I'm not talking to my supervisor. I'm not talking to the regional manager or the assistant to the regional manager. I'm not talking to any of these people. I am talking to God. I'm talking about the one that has created and upholds everything by his power. And me, I'm way, way, way down here. Abraham needed to recognize the rank of the participants. But what's he doing? Little old Abraham is saying, God, you might have a problem. Your character is inconsistent. Your judgment, I don't know about all that. Remember the rank of the participants. Let me show you something. Some of you might have seen, well, actually just a very few of you because it got taken care of earlier. I'll be right back. All right, so anyway, I have kind of a normal parking spot-ish. I park kind of in the same area over here on this side normally because, well, if you get here at 8 o'clock, then there's plenty of parking spots to look at, and so that way I kind of park in the same general area. But when I came this morning, there was this gotcha towing. Parking reserved for the Reverend Michael Owens, towing enforced without mercy by gotcha towing at owner's expense. I'm thinking somebody whose names rhyme with Abi and Onda might have had something to do with this. But some of you remember, it's about a year or so ago, maybe 2 years or so ago, I guess, that Nathan was participating with some ministry event at school, and his car got towed by Gotcha Towing, and so this was put out here. And so the prank was on me this morning, and I appreciate sincerely this, but Philip was with me, and I had Philip take it out. And it's not because, Lord knows I love a joke as good as anybody, but I didn't want anybody to get the wrong message because I'm aware, and maybe you have been to places where the preacher has an assigned parking place. I hate that. I loathe that. But you get there early, you can park wherever you want to. You don't have to say, this is my spot, because if you have a reserved parking space, do you know what that says? That communicates this: you think you're better than everybody else. Now, I love the joke, but I don't want any of you to think that I might have put this out there. But now that I've said that, I want to put it back. Now we've cleared the air. But sincerely, I don't want to operate with the notion that I think that I recognize there's stuff that God has called me to specifically related to the ministry that might be different than what he has called you to, but I'm not a bit better than you are. You're not a bit better than me. We're in this together. I've got responsibilities. You've got responsibilities. Some of those may be different, but I'm not a bit better. Now, we operate many times that way with each other, and we say, I'm going to do this or I'm not going to do this because I recognize I'm on a level playing field with these other people, or I'm going to tone it down because this person is superior to me because they have this position with me. It is insane that we will do that with each other, that we will alter our behavior, that we will alter our conversation, but yet we will call the God of the universe to task. Do we do that? Absolutely. We'll say, God, why didn't you heal this person? God, why didn't you give me that job? God, why don't you fix my marriage? God, why don't you do X, Y, or Z? I'm just telling you that so many times we operate where we will be in bounds with people, understanding the pecking order, but we lose sight of that with relationship to God. Abraham, I think, gets this wrong. And he starts calling the God of the universe to task. Maybe you're not so just. Maybe you're not operating as you should. Your character might have some cracks in it. Who does Abraham think he is? I don't know, but not down at the bottom. You and I, as we engage the Lord, we need to make sure that we avoid this. This is a real fall hazard. Remember the rank of the participants. Me down here, God at the very top. But there's another thing that you and I need to do, and that's this. We need to make room for being wrong. Make room for being wrong. Why is Abraham having this back and forth with God? And it's well, you're asking 50. Well, how about I give you 45? It's like they're at a yard sale. And they're haggling back and forth, maybe trying to buy a used car, and they're going to haggle on the price. It sounds like there is negotiation that's going on here, but let me be very clear. I don't think for a moment that God is negotiating. He's not. Because God's character, his justice, is right, and it is good. And he allows this conversation to go on because in the end, Abraham finally realizes that God's character is right and his justice is firmly established and correct. But this back and forth goes on, starting in verse 26. And he's like, well, how about 50 people? 50 people. I mean, you got a whole city of people, actually 2 cities of people. Certainly, there's got to be 50 people there. And God says, yeah, for 50, I would, for showing mercy on the 50 innocent, I would spare the cities for just 50 people. All right, how about 45? Yeah, absolutely for 45. And they keep whittling it down. 6 times there's this back and forth as the number goes from 50 all the way down to 10. Now think about that. 10 people in 2 cities. And Abraham is sitting there saying, oh, I can't even come up with 10. Because it was just Lot. In fact, it was just Lot. Even though God shows mercy to his wife and later to his daughters, at the end of the day, it's just Lot that isn't so compromised in these 2 cities. But he's had this back and forth where he's called ultimately into question the character of God, and God is, I think, profoundly patient with him and doesn't rebuke him candidly in the ways that he probably should have. But at the end of this, you get to verse 32. Suppose there are 10 found there. God says, I will not destroy it on account of 10. And then you see verse 33. When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he departed, and Abraham returned to his place. It does seem, and again, we're not told any more than what is described here in this passage, but it's entirely possible that's exactly how the conversation ended. How about 10? Yeah, I will not for 10. And at that point, Abraham can't even come up with 10. Not even 10 people. And doesn't say anything. God walks away, and we're told that Abraham goes back to his place and goes about his business. Here's the thing. I think Abraham's intentions were good. I think he had the right thought. We should want to and seek to protect those that are innocent. And justice should be that out-of-bounds behavior gets dealt with consequence, and that should be as limited as possible. Not only do I think that Abraham had decent and positive motivation, I think he even had right theology. And the theology that he was operating on is this, that God is just. That God takes sin seriously. And it is of consequence, and he will bring to bear consequence for that. I think all of those things are true. I think his motivation and his theology was right. Here's the problem. His facts were wrong. And you can have right intention, right motivation, right theology, and bad facts, and start arguing with God. And it seems as though Abraham at this point is kind of dug in. Well, for 50 people, you wouldn't do that, would you? Well, no, not for 50. Well, how about 45? Well, how about 40? But 25? And so the auction continues. We keep lowering the price. We finally get down to 10. And he realizes, oh, it really is that bad. What God said about their wickedness, it really is true. Some of you are Civil War buffs. So others may not be, but there's another Abraham that we are familiar with in the United States, of course, and that's Abraham Lincoln. And during the Civil War, Lincoln had a general named George McClellan, who was a brilliant general and was respected for his military expertise and his knowledge, and it was not accidental that he had risen to the rank of general. But this was a guy that was in the position of overwhelming authority, but he was not just cautious, but he was excessively cautious. And virtually every time that Lincoln would give an order to say, I need you to do this, or issue a directive to say, start marching on or start launching an attack against so-and-so, then you would have McClellan come back with all of these reasons why it's just not perfect. Well, there's a slight breeze from the east at 2.6 miles per hour, and the dew is very heavy. We could be slippery. It was just all of these excuses always. And so many times he would respond, though, well, because the scouting reports indicate X, Y, or Z. And repeatedly, Lincoln was giving orders, and McClellan would say, we can't do it, we can't do it, we can't do it, we can't do it. And at one point, he writes a letter home and says this, I have to contend against the president. I have to save the country without his help. That's what McClellan's thoughts actually were. And at one point, Lincoln has directed him to launch an assault against Confederate forces. And McClellan says, I can't do that. There are 150,000 Confederates. That's what the spies have come back and said. The scouting report says there's 150,000 Confederates. How many were there? 60,000. Well, 60,000 is a lot, but it's not 150,000. And so he refuses to advance. Why? Because he is so convinced that he is right and will not, with the right motivation, he doesn't want to waste human life. He doesn't want to unnecessarily put his men at risk. You don't want to go into a fight that you're certain to be slaughtered in. And so it winds up that this brilliant general has to get relieved of his command by Abraham Lincoln. And it wasn't because McClellan had bad intention. It wasn't because he didn't have positive aspiration. It wasn't because he wasn't thinking about the men that he was leading and valuing the reality of human life. But he dug his heels in because all he could look at was that one little screen, and that screen indicated, oh, there's 150,000. He could not see what Lincoln had exposure to, which was the big picture, and knew that this was an attack that needed to take place. He got relieved of his duty because, why? He dug his heels in, wrong about the facts. Abraham, he's initially kind of digging his heels in. And then he comes to discover, oh, I didn't know what God knows. I mean, I thought it was kind of bad. I mean, I thought it was kind of seedy what was going on over there. But, you know, I just knew there had to be 50 decent people in those cities, and there weren't. He knew, was certain that there had to be 10 righteous people that took seriously the standards of God and even the standards of nature written on our hearts. But there weren't. And finally, God in his great patience, he doesn't berate Abraham, but he discovers, oh, I didn't know so much after all. As you and I engage the Lord, remember your rank, but also remember how little you know, how small your perspective is. And so many times we come to God and we have these requests and we're so certain, well, the best thing that could happen is if God grants me this. God, if you'll give me this job, then I will serve you faithfully. God, if you will give me this house, then I will give sacrificially. God, if you will heal this person, then I will do X, Y, or Z. We're so certain that in this particular context, we know exactly what is right. And what we need to do is to start with this premise. I have some perspective, but it's very limited. And so I'm going to begin my conversation reserving the right to be wrong. And instead of making more directives, maybe I ought to ask more questions. Listen, God is bigger than your out-of-bounds statements to him. And there are plenty of times where you and I could say, yeah, I have been dishonoring or disrespectful. I've been casual or cavalier in talking to him. He didn't melt. He didn't cry on his pillow. But he does want you to learn. He invites you into conversation with him, but he wants you to remember the rank of the participants. But he also wants you to start with the premise of your limitation, for me to start with the premise of my limitation, to make room for being wrong. And when we operate that way, then we remember who we're talking to and how we should be engaging him. And when that happens, we're able to have the relationship with God, the conversation with God, not only that we can have, but that we should have. Will you bow your heads with me?